Wine glass was sitting right there on the counter, already poured, already waiting for me. My son-in-law had set it out before I even came downstairs. That detail didn't strike me as strange until 3 days later. Let me back up. My name is Beverly. I'm 63 years old, and I live in the same house in Sudbury, Ontario that my husband Warren and I bought 31 years ago. We raised 2 kids here, our daughter Lena and our son Patrick. Warren died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. By the time we understood what we were dealing with, there wasn't much left to do except hold his hand and tell him things we should have said more often. After Warren passed, I did what widows in their late 50s do. I kept going. I tended the garden. I volunteered at the library on Thursdays. I called Lena every Sunday. I learned to cook for one, which is lonelier than it sounds. Patrick had moved to Calgary 2 years before Warren died. He'd married a woman named Sylvia, a chartered accountant, very composed, very precise, and they had a little boy, Marcus, who was 4 at the time of Warren's funeral. Patrick flew back for the service. He stayed 5 days. Then he went back to his life, which I understood, even if part of me wished he hadn't. Lena stayed closer. She'd married a man named Craig 8 years ago. Craig sold commercial real estate and did well at it. They lived about 20 minutes from me, in a newer neighborhood, with wide driveways and those big windows that look impressive but let in a terrible draft. Lena called herself an interior decorator, though mostly she worked on friends' homes and renovation projects that Craig's contacts sent her way. They were comfortable. Maybe more than comfortable. I won't pretend I loved Craig from the start. He was the kind of man who filled a room with himself without seeming to notice he was doing it. Loud opinions, easy confidence, always the one redirecting a conversation back to something he'd done or seen or built. Warren had been quiet, a listener. Craig was the opposite of that, and I think that's why I found him exhausting in a way I couldn't fully justify. But Lena loved him, and Lena was happy as far as I could tell, so I kept my thoughts to myself and passed the breadbasket and smiled at his stories about deals and square footage. The dream happened on a Tuesday night in early March. I had gone to bed around 10, which is my usual time in winter. The nights in Sudbury in March still get down below -15, and there's something about that cold that makes you want to burrow under the duvet and disappear. I fell asleep quickly, the way I usually do. Warren came to me in the dream. I know how that sounds. I'm not a superstitious woman. I've never put much stock in things I can't verify. But he was there, wearing the blue flannel shirt he always wore on weekends, the one with the frayed collar that I'd meant to replace for years and never did. And he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was worried, not panicked, just still and serious, and watching me with that particular attention that meant he needed me to listen carefully. He said, "Bev, don't drink what Craig gives you." That was all. Not a long speech, not a dramatic vision, just that one sentence, in his voice, the voice I hadn't heard in 4 years. And then I was awake and staring at the ceiling with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay there for a long time. The clock said 2:14. I could hear the wind off the lake. I told myself it was grief, the ordinary kind, the kind that ambushes you when you least expect it and dresses itself up in strange clothing. I'd read somewhere that dreams of deceased spouses are especially common in the 2nd through 5th year after loss. The brain processing, the heart catching up, perfectly normal, but I couldn't get back to sleep. The next morning I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the snow on the back fence and thought about Warren's face, that expression. I had spent 34 years learning to read that face. And even in a dream, even 4 years after I'd last seen it in waking life, I knew what that expression meant. He wasn't processing grief. He was warning me. I called Lena that afternoon, the way I would on any regular day, and listened for anything off in her voice. She sounded fine, cheerful even. She told me Craig had been in a great mood lately, that the big commercial deal had finally closed, that they were thinking of taking Marcus. No, wait. Marcus was Patrick's boy. I'm getting confused now. Lena and Craig didn't have children. They tried for a few years, and then they'd stopped trying. and Lena had put herself into her work instead. I always thought there was a grief inside her about that. A quiet one. She'd arranged furniture around. She mentioned that Craig was planning a birthday dinner for me that weekend. My birthday is March 8th. I turn 63 every year on the 8th of March, and for the past 3 years Craig had made a point of doing the cooking himself. He fancied himself a decent cook, and he enjoyed the performance of it, the apron, the glass of red he'd carry around the kitchen while explaining what he was making. I'd always been politely appreciative. "He's making that lamb thing again," Lena said. "And he wants to do a proper wine pairing this time. He's been looking it up." "That sounds lovely," I said. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap for a while. Don't drink what Craig gives you. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The weekend came. I drove over Saturday evening with a bottle of Niagara Riesling that I'd picked up at the LCBO because I'd been raised to never arrive empty-handed. Craig answered the door in his apron, holding a wooden spoon, and kissed me on the cheek the way he always did, that slightly performative warmth that I'd never entirely trusted. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic. Lena came out of the living room and hugged me properly. The table was set nicely, candles, the good dishes that I suspected Craig had chosen rather than Lena because they were more impressive than cozy, and already on the table, at my place, a glass of red wine, pre-poured, waiting. "Craig picked it specially," Lena said. "He's been doing research." I looked at the glass, deep burgundy, perfectly ordinary. "Don't drink what Craig gives you." "Could I actually start with water?" I said. "Long drive over. I'm a bit dehydrated." Craig looked at me for just a moment. Something crossed his face. I couldn't name it exactly. And then he smiled and said, "Of course, absolutely," and went to get water. I watched the wine glass for the rest of the evening. I didn't touch it. I made excuses. Too much on an empty stomach. I've been taking that new vitamin and it interacts strangely. And Craig refilled Lena's glass twice, but didn't push me further. Which I noticed. He was the type to push. The type to say, "Come on, just a sip. You're at a birthday dinner." He didn't. I drove home that night thinking I had imagined everything. Then I found the documents. It happened by accident, the way most things do. I had left my reading glasses at Lena's. I discovered this when I got home and went looking for them. And so the following Tuesday, I stopped by while Craig was at work, and Lena had her weekly lunch with a friend from her decorating days. I had a key. I let myself in, found the glasses on the side table by the couch, and was heading back out when I noticed the door to Craig's home office was open. It wasn't usually open. Craig was particular about his office. He kept it closed. He'd said once, in the way people say things that are meant to sound casual but aren't, that he didn't like clutter migrating in from the rest of the house. I'd taken that to mean he didn't want anyone in there. Lena didn't push back on things like that. She'd learned a particular kind of careful navigation around Craig, and I'd watched her do it for years without fully naming what I was seeing. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked in. I told myself I was just going to glance. I wasn't going to touch anything. I just wanted to see what was in plain view. What was in plain view was a manila folder on the corner of the desk. It was labelled, in Craig's neat block letters, "I endurance, Beverly." My hands went cold. I opened it. Inside was a life insurance policy. My name on it, issued 18 months earlier. Beneficiary listed, Craig Hollis Dempster. Not Lena. Craig. The coverage was for $400,000. I stood there in that office for what felt like a very long time. I could hear the furnace running. I could hear a snowplow somewhere on the street outside. Why would Craig take out a life insurance policy on me? Without my knowledge, without my signature? Though when I looked more carefully at the documents, I saw my signature was there, on page 4, in my handwriting. Except I had never signed those pages. I was certain of it. I would have remembered. I took a photograph of every page with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I walked out to my car and sat in the driveway for several minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I want to be clear about something. I did not immediately call the police. I did not immediately call Lena. I did not do anything dramatic. I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what I actually knew versus what I was afraid of. What I knew, Craig had taken out a $400,000 life insurance policy on me. My signature appeared on documents I had no memory of signing. He had poured me a glass of wine at my birthday dinner and not pushed me to drink it when I declined. What I was afraid of, the obvious conclusion. I thought about Warren's face in that dream. I thought about the way Craig had looked at me for just a moment when I asked for water instead. I called my friend Pauline that afternoon. Pauline had been a paralegal for 22 years before she retired, and she was the most practically minded person I had ever known. I told her everything. She didn't react dramatically. She just listened, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Bev, you need to speak to a lawyer before you do anything else." I saw a lawyer in town the next day, a woman named Hartley, older than me, no nonsense, in the way that Sudbury women of a certain generation often are. She looked at the photographs I'd taken and told me a few things. First, taking out a life insurance policy on another person without their informed consent is fraud in Canada. The signature that appeared on those documents would need to have been witnessed, notarized, produced somehow. If I hadn't signed it, someone had forged it. Second, a spouse is typically the default beneficiary in these situations, not a son-in-law. The fact that Craig had named himself rather than Lena was irregular. Third, and most carefully, she told me that before I confronted anyone or went to police, I should document everything I could and speak to the RCMP or local OPP about the forgery. I drove home from her office, feeling like the ground had tilted slightly under everything. I also started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed things. Craig called me more than usual. Just checking in, he'd say. "How are you feeling?" "Sleeping. Okay?" He'd never been particularly interested in my sleeping habits before. I mentioned, offhandedly, during one of these calls that I'd been having some dizziness. I made it up. I wanted to see what he did with it. He got very concerned. Said maybe I should see my GP. Said he could drive me even if Lena was busy. I thought about that wine glass. I thought about the syringe. I need to tell you about the syringe. I had gone back to Lena's one more time. Again when Craig was out, and I was being more deliberate now, less accidental. I went into his office again. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, behind a row of neatly labeled folders, there was a small zip pouch. Inside the pouch was a glass vial, about the size of my thumb, and a capped syringe. I am not a medical professional. I don't know what was in that vial. But I took photographs of it. And then I sat in my car outside my daughter's house and understood, in a way that left no room for alternate interpretations, that Warren had not been processing grief when he came to me in that dream. He had been telling me the truth. The question I kept coming back to was, why? Warren had left the house to me. I had a modest RRSP, some savings. I was not a wealthy woman by any measure. $400,000 was not nothing, but it was not a fortune either, not for a man who moved millions of dollars of commercial real estate. Unless Craig was in trouble. I called Patrick in Calgary. This was the hardest conversation I'd had in years. He's my son, and I'd kept him at arm's length since Warren died. In that way you do when you're trying not to be a burden. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said he was going to make some calls. Patrick knew people who knew people. He'd spent years in finance before moving into project management, and he still had contacts in that world. Within 4 days, he called me back with information that made everything make sense in the worst possible way. Craig's commercial real estate business was in serious trouble. He'd leveraged himself badly on 3 developments during COVID, projects that had stalled, investors who'd pulled out, carrying costs that had compounded into something that was no longer manageable. He was approximately $900,000 in personal debt, beyond what the business owed. He'd hidden this from Lena. From everyone, as far as anyone could tell, $400,000 would not have cleared that debt, but it would have bought him time. My life was worth time. I went to the OPP. I want to be honest about how frightening that was. Not physically. I was never afraid that Craig would hurt me on the street. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of what it would mean for Lena. I was afraid they wouldn't believe a 63-year-old woman who had a strange dream and then went snooping in her son-in-law's desk. The officer I spoke with was younger than Lena. She had the kind of careful, professional face that gives nothing away. I laid out everything I had, the photographs, the timeline, the information from Patrick. She took notes. She asked questions that were precise and unsentimental. The kind of questions that made me feel like she was actually listening rather than managing me. She said they would look into it. Over the following 3 weeks, things happened that I was not entirely privy to. I know that investigators examined the insurance documents and confirmed that the signature on page 4 was not mine. The notarization had been fabricated through a former client of Craig's, who had since lost his own license. I know that the vial in Craig's filing cabinet was submitted for analysis. I know that investigators spoke to people Craig had dealt with financially and found a pattern of behavior that, in retrospect, should have alarmed someone years earlier. What I know clearly is the day the police came. It was a Thursday morning in April, late enough in the spring that some of the snow had finally retreated from the yard. I was at home. Lena called me from the driveway of their house. She'd come home from a client meeting to find 2 OPP vehicles there, and she was crying in a way I hadn't heard her cry since Warren's funeral. Not loud. That terrible quiet crying, the kind that means something has broken inside a person. Craig was arrested on charges including fraud, forgery, and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. The last charge related to a separate matter that came out during the investigation, an incident involving a former business partner that I won't go into here because it's still before the courts. He was released on bail. The conditions of his release do not permit him to contact me. As for the vial, the substance inside was identified as potassium chloride. In sufficient doses, injected into food or drink, it can cause cardiac arrest. It is very difficult to trace in an autopsy because it occurs naturally in the body. I have thought about that wine glass many times since then. Lena is living with me now. She moved in 6 weeks after Craig's arrest, once she'd accepted that the marriage was not something she could salvage, and probably hadn't been for years. She cries sometimes in the evenings, and I make tea and sit with her and don't try to fix it, because some things can't be fixed, only survived. She started working with a therapist in town. She is going to be all right. I know her. She comes from people who are going to be all right. Patrick drove out from Calgary last month with Sylvia and Marcus. Marcus is 7 now, and loud in the lovely, uncomplicated way that 7-year-olds are loud. He broke a lamp in the living room by accident, and was so mortified about it that I nearly cried laughing. It was the most I'd laughed since the whole thing started. On the last night of their visit, after the kids were in bed, Patrick and Lena and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and just talked about Warren, about the house, about what comes next. Patrick kept looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite name. Not pity, something more like relief. At one point, Lena said quietly, "Do you really think it was Dad? In the dream?" I thought about that flannel shirt with the frayed collar. That still, serious face. "I think something was," I said. I've stopped trying to explain it more precisely than that. There are things that happen that don't fit neatly into what I thought I understood about the world, and I've reached an age where I'm less committed to forcing them to fit. Warren was a quiet man who paid attention. Maybe that doesn't stop just because the body does. I don't know. I'm 63 years old and I've buried a husband and nearly been buried myself. And what I've learned is that you hold the people who are still here a little tighter and you listen, really listen, when something is trying to tell you something. The wine glass is long gone. The house smells like Lena's coffee in the mornings now. Last Thursday we planted the first seeds of the year in the cold frame out back, my daughter and I, on our knees in the mud, and she laughed at something I said, and for a moment she looked so much like the girl she used to be that I had to look away. We're going to be okay. I keep coming back to that wine glass, the way it was already poured, the way Craig didn't push me when I said no, and how that silence told me more than any argument would have. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes after something like this, not immediately. It took months before I could think about it without my hands going cold, but eventually you sit with it long enough that you start to understand what actually happened, not just the facts of it, but the shape of it, how it got that far, how it almost went differently. Craig made choices. One at a time, over years, he chose to hide things rather than face them. He chose to keep the debt secret from Lena instead of asking for help. He chose to solve a financial problem the way a person does when they've stopped thinking of other people as fully real. Each of those choices made the next one easier. That's how it works. Dishonesty doesn't announce itself all at once. It grows in the dark, quietly, in the spaces where honesty was too uncomfortable to live. I don't say this to excuse him. I say it because I think it matters to understand that what happened to my family wasn't a sudden thing. It was a long accumulation of small decisions made by someone who had stopped asking himself the hard questions. What kind of person am I becoming? What am I willing to do? Where is the line I won't cross? Those questions require a kind of moral seriousness that Craig had stopped practicing long before he ever opened that insurance folder with my name on it. What saved me was the opposite of that. I paid attention. When something felt wrong, I didn't talk myself out of it to avoid discomfort. I looked. I asked. I found a lawyer and a police officer and my son on the phone from Calgary, and I let people help me rather than managing it alone. That took a kind of clear-headedness that I'm not sure I would have had at 40. At 63, after burying a husband and raising 2 children and living long enough to know that your instincts are usually trying to tell you something, you learn to take your own perceptions seriously. And then there was the staying power of it. The weeks of not knowing whether anyone would believe me. The terror of going into that police station and laying out what I had and waiting to see if it was enough. The hardest part wasn't the danger, it was the sustained uncertainty. Not knowing how it would end. Choosing to keep going anyway. That's not courage in the dramatic sense. It's just deciding, one morning at a time, that you are worth fighting for. Lena is sleeping down the hall from me as I write this. She's rebuilding her life with the same quiet determination I always knew she had, even when Craig spent years trying to sand it down. Patrick is back in Calgary with his family, checking in more than he used to. The house is fuller than it's been in years. I think about Warren sometimes and what he would make of all of this. I think he would have been unsurprised by Craig and very unsurprised by Lena, and maybe a little proud of me for not talking myself out of what I knew. Some things you can't explain. You just have to be willing to listen when they're trying to reach you.